So welcome. Today we're looking at building knowledge and understanding of GenAI with students. I'm Sally Goldberg-Powell and I use she, her pronouns. I am the Teaching Resources and Technology Specialist at the Digital Learning Team at Center for Excellence in Learning and Teaching, which is a mouthful. And to add to that mouthful, I also teach part-time in the School of Journalism where I teach first year mandatory courses. And so I've already had this conversation this semester already for my particular students and their interests. The course I'm teaching right now is called Visualizing Facts, and so we focused on that part of the conversation. And this will be a bit broader, but it doesn't mean that you can't take the notes from today to think about how you might approach it for your particular course. As I've shared a couple times, we have the links to the slides in the chat, and I'll get going. So the first thing I was wanting to do is just in the chat, or you could feel free to unmute because they're a small group, but for now I think we'll just use the chat. Just trying to get a sense of where everybody is in terms of how they're feeling about GenAI, especially in the classroom. Are you feeling like diving right in, or maybe you're all the way at number 4 where you're just like, I'll just stay here, thanks, and you'd rather not have it in your classroom at all if you could possibly avoid it. So just to type in the chat what number you feel you're at. Are you testing waters, feeling the pressure? Yeah, it definitely feels that way, Jennifer, where it's like the students are at 1 and you're at 2. David says between a 2 and a 3 as well. Yeah, I'm actually feeling 2 and 2, 3, 2, 2, 3 as well. Even though we are in the center and our job requires us to be aware of GenAI and to support instructors and faculty who are trying to integrate or mitigate GenAI in different ways, the truth is that it's changing so quickly. There is concerns. I'm definitely not diving right in because I have those concerns. And I think we might be surprised by students and where they land on this too. But to stay in the realm of faculty instructors for a moment, I think for a lot of us, all these things are coming into play with how we feel in terms of our confidence when it comes to talking about this stuff. So we're looking at things like trying to learn and maintain currency about GenAI, which is constantly evolving and changing. We're trying to reflect on our own role and how it's being impacted by this. So it could be just generally speaking in your own career, whatever shape that takes, whether you're working part-time as an instructor, whether this has to do with your own research, your own discipline. It's impacting us in all different ways, right? And then, like you want to explore how students could maybe learn using it maybe, or just consider the new realities or share your understanding with confidence. But all these things are difficult to do without having the time and the bandwidth to do this, which seems like its own full-time job. And so I just have a quote on the side there. I've got a few quotes through the slides of other people talking about this and how, you're feeling that pressure from so many different levels of this is definitely impacting things, whether we like it or not, there's some impact. And trying to navigate that all while trying to support our students' learning. And so that's when I started thinking about where students are. And the more I've spoken with students, the more I open up opportunities to talk together, the more I realize that they're all over the place too. So they're probably in all those 4 spots that we are, as much as looking for some support and guidance. It's amazing how many students are like, yeah, I'd really love to learn how to use this properly, rather than just plugging in what I think will help me get my work done quicker or what I tempted to do. Worried about making a mistake or being left behind. So both things. So worried that they will use it in a way where they'll get in trouble in class, or worried about not using it enough so they don't know how to use it if they're asked to in the future. But then there's also a large cohort, and I feel this cohort might be growing a little bit. There's definitely one of these in my household who's only 15, but definitely in this headspace, which is this is the end of the world. We're ruining the planet. Keep it away from me. Or art is going to die. We're ruining everything. Everything's AI slop, and very averse to using it at all. So that group I feel is very vocal sometimes, or at least very adamant about not touching GenAI. So just being aware of all those voices or thoughts that might be in one classroom. I was actually speaking to a colleague who works in computer science recently, and she said she was starting to get some of those vibes from students as well, where some students, even within disciplines where you might think they'd be more open, are starting to be resistant to some versions of generative AI in particular. So this is the thing I want us to sort of remember, is that we're all kind of at sea, and it's good to remind ourselves that we're all in the same boat, and that means working with students and not working in silos from each other, but having these conversations together, which is the point of today's workshop. So today we're really looking at laying the groundwork to discuss and explore GenAI with students. So rather than feeling like you have to come in as the expert, starting from that point of view. So just so you know that that's the focus, is just talking about how we talk about it. There's a lot of other aspects of Gen AI, and that often bleeds into conversations that we have about this realm, because there's just so many questions and so many different ways to look at what's happening and its impacts, and things that you might be concerned about. So just be aware we have other workshops coming. We also have a large repository of our previous workshops, and even 2 digests that my colleague David, who's here in the room with us to help support me today, David Arumba has put together these 2 great digests of previous workshops that will take you through the highlights. I think he might be adding links to those right now. So yep, there you go. Some links are coming in. So just so you know, there are lots of opportunities to talk about this in different ways, but we're going to try and focus the conversation in one particular way today. Another thing I want to draw your eye to on this slide is that not only are we offering consultations one-on-one with folks, but if you want to bring this back to your department, we do also offer sessions for departments and faculties to talk about Gen AI more specifically to a discipline-specific lens, because we do find that really helpful rather than relying solely on general workshops. So if that's something you think that someone in your department might want to look into, or you'd like to take that to someone, just know that that's another option. So we always put these disclaimers, they're in our guides and they're in our workshops, that these things are constantly changing. So if you happen to be one of those people watching this recording down the line, be aware that some of the things that we talk about today might be obsolete by the time you're watching the video. And also, as an instructor here at TMU, we do have to adhere to privacy guidelines. And so there's some suggestions of how to use GenAI in the classroom and what you can ask students to do, as well as ways that you use a GenAI in terms of the kind of data you can put in there that will be within the privacy expectations of the institution. So just be aware of that as we go through this conversation. So now we'll get into it. So we're going to start with understanding GenAI. That means we're going to do a really basic Gen AI literacy block. The reason I'm doing this too is so that hopefully I'm giving you some slides that they might be helpful to have in your own, that you can feel free to use in your own presentations. That said, I did mean to put on like a Creative Commons license on those slides, and I haven't done that yet, so I might add those after the workshop, just so that you can just copy and paste them and put them into yours, and they'll already be cited for you, so you don't have to worry about that. But know that some of the things that we're going to do today are kind of meta, so the idea of showing you how things that you can take some of these things and bring them into your own conversations with your students. So we'll start with that brief sort of overview, as brief as I can make it, as simple as I can make it when it's such a complex topic. Then we'll go into ways to discuss GenAI in class and how to think that through, as well as exploring GenAI in class, so that means doing demonstrations of it and why that might be a way of approaching it. Finally, some resources and next steps that you can think about, and we'll have some time to discuss as well. And so with that, I will continue into the meat of today. So understanding GenAI, even if you don't plan to use it. So the idea here is that, regardless of whether you're going to want to use these tools, it's good to have a basic understanding of them, to develop some knowledge around this, so you can have a sense of how they might impact your work in the future if you're a student, or even if you already have a career, just having a sense of what's out there, what it's actually capable of doing, what it's not capable of doing, what might change, that kind of thing, and just starting to think about that in a deeper way. So another reason you might want to do this is just to prepare them for that work environment that's coming at them, to build the digital literacy through experience. So by talking about it and demonstrating it, you can build experience in interesting ways, and we'll talk more about demonstrating and why that's an interesting strategy, rather than just having them go do it on their own. And you can also model appropriate use and discourage misuse, or let students know how you feel about it in an open way, and discuss that with them. And how you can consider using these tools in your own work, and how you might want to disclose that or think about that with students. Knowing how they feel about these things might help you make your decisions about how you're using the tools in order to prepare for your class, if that's something you're thinking about. And so I thought we'd do another little activity. So I don't know if you noticed, we did one already where we just put things into the chat. This one is talking about the hype cycle. So this is something that's been thrown around a lot when it comes to Gen AI, because it really feels like it captures how a lot of us are feeling and the activity that's going on in the tech sector around this new technology that's sort of been launched in such a broad, incredibly fast way. So it was developed and intended to help businesses seek opportunities, right? Like, oh, you have to know about the hype cycle so you know when the best time is to launch your product. But it's actually ended up helping us sort of navigate where the heck we are and what the heck's going on. And so with that in mind, I thought it would be kind of cool to see if we can all give this a go. I'll throw this into the chat as well. Copy link. So if you want to go to that link and give it a go, put yourself where you think we are as a generally in society, or as an institute, like as students and faculty, people learning in an institution. Where do you think we are right now in terms of our path along this hype cycle? Do you think, the trigger's being done? We're definitely not at the bottom here. Are we at the actual peak of inflated expectations? Maybe we're starting to come down that hill. Where do you think we are right now? And why I think this would be an interesting thing to do with students is because it would be interesting to see where they think we are right now. It'd help you to understand what they're expecting. So I'm just bringing it up here. And we can see we have a couple of people who have put us at just still coming up to the peak of inflated expectations. One person is putting us slowly coming down the side of the peak. Another person's coming up the slope of enlightenment. So it's interesting to see that we all sort of feel like we're in different places. And, I'm feeling kind of similar to just like that we're coming down the side of the peak, but I'm not sure how far down we are. Personally, I'm pretty far down that hill, but I don't know how everybody else is doing around me. And so seeing how where students would either put themselves or where they think the world is right now would be really telling. So I thought that would be an interesting thing to pull away from this. So with that in mind, we just sort of said, hey, where would you put us in terms of Gen AI? But we didn't talk about what that actually means. And so we're going to take a step back and talk about that for a minute. And one thing I always like to clarify is the idea of Gen AI versus AI. And sometimes we use those terms interchangeably. And there's some debate over whether artificial intelligence is even a good term for this blanket or umbrella grouping of technologies. But just going by what's colloquially accepted, Gen AI is a blanket term and really relates back to a whole bunch of different processes that can be done through training models to interpret things. So basically it's a way of setting up a type of learning by computers that mimics the way that humans might think, or was based on the idea of mimicking how humans think. Whereas Gen AI is one subset of this that uses often several models to do what it needs to do. So one of the big things that it uses often is large language processing, and that allows you to use plain language, especially in English, and that's coming online with more and more languages all the time. But being able to use a plain language to ask for something, and it will respond with a response no matter what you ask for. And that's part of what makes it so difficult to talk about, because almost anything you can ask for, it will try and execute for you. Whether it can do it or not is another question, but it will often try, or it will tell you it can't, but often you will get a response. So saying exactly what this tool is for can be really tricky. This is another diagram that shows it in a different way. One thing you could think about doing with students is to disseminate these different diagrams of what AI is and how it fits into the bigger picture, and get them to think about it and maybe share back. So I've shared a few different ones that I've found. This one sort of puts AI at the top level bubble, and then generative AI is sort of overlapping with deep learning here inside another bubble of machine learning. And so it's really focusing on generative AI and where it fits, and doesn't really think about or doesn't really illustrate the other types of AI. Here's another one that is a tree, a mind map that explains how it all works. So you can see how, especially 16, and I'll go back to 14, have some similarities, but branch it out in different ways or show it in different ways. And so, it's not that any of these are necessarily incorrect. It just depends on your starting point and what you're trying to illustrate. But it's an interesting thing to think through, like what are we exactly talking about? What part of this are we talking about? And you could say that, we've got text to speech under speech recognition, but natural language processing might also be involved in it when it does that transition between, once it's into speech or speech to text, once it's in text, it might be using natural language processing to then generate a question. Like all these sort of are intertwined with each other. So it's complicated to talk about. I think the big thing I'm pulling away from this, though, is that GenAI is a separate thing, a very specific thing that we want to talk about. So this is thanks to my colleague Matilda Dougherty, who put this together. And what they've shown here is that, if you look at AI as being the top level, then we've got generative AI as being a type of AI, but it's using LLMs and that's put into chatbots. And that what we often think about are things like Gemini, ChatGPT, and Claude as the way that we're interacting with these things. So sometimes we'll throw around like AI does this, and what we really mean is Gemini does this, or a large language model will do this. And so just being aware of our language and being specific can be helpful in having conversations. This is a diagram I made a while ago that we used at one of our first workshops, and I keep pulling it back out because I find it helpful to think about the process that you go through when you use one of these chatbots or any other sort of generative AI tool. The idea is that you're putting in some sort of input, and that might just be part of your prompt, or that could be another input that's put in along with a prompt, right? So you can provide a document, an image, a multimedia file sometimes, depending on the complexity or sophistication of the tool you're using. And that goes along with a prompt. So the prompt part, so if it's text, you might provide some context, and that might be your input. And then your prompt is what to do with that context that you've provided. So it's telling the machine what you need. And then it does an analysis of what you've put in and gives you an output. At that point, it usually requires some reprompting to say, no, this is not exactly what I wanted, or can you elaborate, or can you specify, or can you provide more options? Can you provide different ways I could do this? And then you go back to the analysis again, and there's a loop. And the reason I like to break it down this way is to think about what is happening at each point in this process can be a helpful way of thinking about talking about it as well. So not looking at the whole, but breaking it down and thinking about what kinds of inputs do we feel are okay? What types of prompts will actually generate something that's helpful? What types of prompts maybe could generate something helpful, but I could just think of them on my own and get an answer just as quickly as using one of these tools, so why bother? Like, those kind of decision-making points. Thinking through what happens really when you have an analysis going on by one of these machines. What is it actually thinking, quote unquote, right? What is it doing? And then thinking about the output, like what am I provided with? What do I know about what I've been provided with? Where are there places where I think I need to think further about these things? And then how do I make sure I refine and think through what I'm doing to get a better response? And how many times am I going to have to do that given what I'm trying to do? So at all of these steps, there's places where there's moments for discussion. So you may have noticed on that chart I have something called beep boop magic when it comes to analysis, which is one of my colleagues' favorite parts of this. Yay, boop boop magic. I mean, the reason I call it that is there's a really good reason for it, and that's that, the truth is we're still trying to figure out exactly how the learning happens during this process. There are parts of this process that are still kind of a mystery. There is a whole team at Anthropic, who are the people behind Claude, trying to figure out exactly what's going on in the training part that is taken over by the actual model. And so, to suggest that we all understand how this works, or for me to even suggest that because I've been looking into this for a few years, that I understand. Excellent, David said beep boop in the last meeting. To suggest that we understand that, it's suggesting a certain level of knowledge and understanding that likely very few people, if any, understand at this point in this world. So when you come across people who call themselves experts, this is my warning, and one you might want to give your students, and they say they understand exactly what's happening when GenAI is doing its work, they're probably being a little bit um, too certain of themselves. Let's just put it that way. I think it's better to approach this whole space with a certain sense of humility, and I think that's a large part of what I'm saying in today's workshop. But this just takes you through all the steps of what actually happens. So there's creating a model, there's multiple layers in that model that are created, but they're not all basically like written yet. They're just created as levels, and the levels are things like notice characteristics, and then the next level would be, okay, notice how two characteristics relate to each other. Okay, now notice how the paired characteristics here and the paired characteristics here, they relate to each other. Okay, now on this level, you'll look at bigger groupings. And so it's like this whole leveled learning thing set up. So there's like a framework set up. And then you start doing the learning. So you say, okay, here's a picture of this, and you ask it to respond. And you go, no, that's not quite right. It's this. Or you start even before that, actually, where you say, this is a dog, this is a dog, this is a dog, this is a dog, and then you send a picture of a dog and you say, what is this? And you hope it says dog. And if it doesn't, then you say, no, it's, and so this is how it sort of starts. And that's a really simplified way of explaining it, but it's the best I can do. And then the model starts to adjust its weight. So it was saying, oh, okay, so every time I see a round black nose, I'm going to think dog. But not all dogs have such clear, distinct noses that are like that. Or maybe every time I see a certain type of snout, but that could also be a different kind of animal. So it's not really necessarily thinking that clearly, but it's understanding that, like, okay, so the fact that it has a snout is less important than the fact it has four legs. So it's starting to balance those and measure those and figure out which things it's looking for. Then after all these things happen, there's a safety training and alignment process, which basically is making sure it won't give answers that are, offensive or upsetting or those kinds of things. And that, again, depends on who's building the thing, as we've heard a lot of stuff about Grok lately and things it's showing. We know that this, depends on how rigorous this is and the way it's done and how it's tested. Anyway, so there's all of that to think about as well. Then it's deployed, and then we get to use it. So again, there's more text here than what I just said, but this is as clear as a way I could explain it in 7 steps as I possibly could. And you'll notice that not only did I take this from hearing and listening carefully to a conversation between Jon Stewart and Geoffrey Hinton, but then I took it and talked to Gemini about it in Gemini 3, the version that we have here. And then I took what I got from that conversation and shared it with Preeti Raman from the School of Department of Computer Science here, and she revised it again, and this is what we came up with. So as good as I can do in 7 steps. So feel free again to share this. What I did on the next page is to start putting some of the questions that might pop up for you in this type of thinking. So if it's just statistically thinking about things, what about creativity? Can we really ask it to make a picture for us and create images for us and have it be something new and fresh? What's happening to our connection to creativity? You're feeding a large amount of data. What data? Whose data? What data? The learning begins. Like, is this really learning? And is this how humans learn? Now, Geoffrey Hinton says, yeah, if you think about an infant learning how to speak or how to get what they need from parents, they're doing trial and error and figuring out in the realm of possibilities, what do I need to do? What do I need to say? What sounds go together to get what I need? And would suggest that, yeah, this is based on how we learn. But how far can that go? Like, maybe it's how humans learn when they're infants or toddlers, but maybe this isn't how, adults continue to learn. Maybe there's more to it. It's an interesting place to chat, right? There's also the ecological impacts, right? And that also leads to social impacts in terms of where they're putting these servers and how much energy they're consuming and what do we have enough energy for these things? Are we causing other people to not have the energy they need? So much to talk about there. Safety training and alignment is fraught with ethical issues around who has been asked to do that work. And early on, there were some very disturbing talks or facts coming out around who was doing the training, how low paying it was, and how traumatic it was to have to go through and say, no, this is offensive all day long, or identify things that would be offensive and say, don't do this, don't do that, don't do this, and how that's done. And of course, we can ask it almost anything, But how safe is what we're putting in there, right? And how much should we really trust the companies that we're giving our information over to not use it or store it, or where does it go while it's doing its reboot magic? It's still a question we don't feel 100% certain about, no matter how much we have a written licensed agreement. Like, what happens if, down the road Google goes under? Not that it's likely, but it could, and then what would happen to our data? We just don't know, right? Yeah. So all that said, Preeti also shared this with me, and so it's another way of visualizing how you create a chatbot, which I thought was a helpful one to share as well. And so there's an attribution there for you if you'd like to use this slide. And so to wrap up this part, I'm going to start wrapping up the knowledge part, and we'll go into the bigger stuff in a second in terms of actually talking about it. GenAI systems are basically created as expert guessers, and they're eager to please. Thanks, Beth. And so we want to make sure that that we're aware of that when we start using them. So if we ask them something and we say it in an affirmative, it's more likely to say, yes, you're right, than if we just ask it to prove whether or not there's pros or cons to something. When a GenAI system answers a prompt, the response is likely to be at least slightly different every time. So because it's a prediction machine, it often predicts slightly differently. So you can't be guaranteed you'll get the same output every time you put in the same prompt. And GenAI cannot perform true out-of-the-box thinking because it's using a predictive method of taking stuff it already knows and trying to address what you're talking about based on its knowledge base. So having completely novel thoughts is not exactly what it's built to do. Before we go into discussing, I just wanted to draw your attention to the GenAI Literacy Guide. This is a guide that I created along with a committee that I led a while ago about teaching or tech support for GenAI moving forward, and we made this GenAI Literacy Guide together. I believe that you are now getting a copy of that in the chat, although my chat for some reason won't scroll for me. There it is. And so that is a tool, that is a guide you're more than welcome to share with your students as well. So when it comes to discussion, this is another quote that I brought up, even bigger. But the idea is that having the willingness to expose what remains unsettled and being willing to admit that you don't know all the answers is one of the most valuable things to your students. The idea too that, even if you're not an expert in GenAI, you are an expert in what you are teaching. And so being able to apply your expertise to this question helps to provide you with some ways to add value to the conversation for your students that they wouldn't have otherwise. And so not to undervalue that expertise that you do have in having these conversations. So the idea here is that right now I'm using the learning zone model, which was based on an idea called zone of proximal development. Proximal development. Oh great, this is going to be recorded and put on the YouTubes. Yay. So basically the idea here is that if we just stay in our comfort zone, learning won't really happen. And so even though it's an uncomfortable place to be to talk about GenAI, when we talk about with students, we're actually entering a learning zone not just for them, but for ourselves as well. And so the idea of pushing ourselves into a sort of a sweet spot that is known as the learning zone, where, we're not quite just comfortable, but we're also not in a space where we feel really uncomfortable. Finding that space is really helpful to keep in mind as you're having these conversations. So really having curiosity and questions that you're looking to sort of look into an area that you feel just a little bit outside of your comfort zone. And remembering that there are a whole bunch of things that both you and students bring to the conversation. First of all, there's expectations, like what you both are sort of anticipating the other is expecting. I think someone mentioned early on that students know what they're doing when it comes to GenAI, and a lot of students would disagree with that. So some students, yes, absolutely. There's some students are really comfortable and at ease, or yeah, they know how to put in a prompt, or they've used ChatGPT, or they've used Gemini, and so they understand that it exists and how it kind of works. But in terms of how it impacts or how it might impact their learning with your particular subject matter, that they don't know, that they probably still have questions about. And they may have made may have expectations or have made assumptions about what you think about that if it's not talked about. They probably have concerns too that they'll use the tool incorrectly or in a way that you would not like and miss something in the class. And you probably have concerns that they won't necessarily, be fully engaged or be doing the learning they're supposed to do if they're using GenAI in ways that you're not aware of. But there's a lot of things that you both bring. You bring skills that you've learned over time, and those will be different sets of skills. The wonderful thing about students is they all come with different sets of skills. So there's all kinds of different ways you can learn from them. And you're also coming into the room with a set of expertise that you can apply to these things. You also have some academic skills they might not have, so understanding rigor in research and that kind of thing, or how best to approach writing an essay that they might not understand. So being able to really make sure that you understand or that you're conveying that to them can be really helpful. So what I've done on this one is just sort of take what we've talked about already and thrown it into a bit of a matrix of sorts. Or a diagram, I guess it's not really a matrix, of potential ways this discussion could go. So one thing that I would suggest you do right from the beginning is consider an objective or a learning outcome for the conversation. Like, what are you hoping to get out of it? As I mentioned earlier, it's really easy for these conversations to go off topic. To go into whatever is most of concern to people or the latest thing they read about. There's been some, really big stories around this that are really, impactful and draw people's attention and are important to discuss, but might not be the purpose of your conversation. So really clarifying what that is and thinking about what your objective is. And then you want to have a discussion. And this might require you to provide a little bit of base understanding or base knowledge to sort of frame the conversation, as well as applying a discipline or subject matter lens to ensure that the conversation is pertinent to the classroom that you're having. Another thing I'm kind of cognizant of and concerned around is the idea that students are going from class to class. Most students have between 3 to 5 classes a semester, and if we're all having the exact same conversation about what do you think about GenAI and doing your assignments, first of all, it's going to get redundant and students are going to stop listening, and second of all, it's not going to be as relevant to them and it's not going to be as engaging. So it's really about tying it to your specific course and your specific course's intentions when you're having the conversation. And then out of that, what you're hoping to have beyond just meeting your objectives is a certain amount of shared or co-created knowledge. So together you're learning, you're coming to some conclusions or surfacing new questions or getting to a different way of thinking about things. So I've got an example here. It's doing it for a creative writing or media production course. And so I have an objective on the side, which is investigate and evaluate industry use of GenAI within our discipline. And then I've set up so that every group is looking at one of those questions I had placed beside the process of creating a GenAI chatbot. And in this class, it might be more about image generation than text generation. And so the idea here is that each group would take one of the questions and work with it by answering 2 other questions. When is there a benefit in using these tools for creative work, and when is it a good idea to avoid using these tools? So looking at the question of if it's statistically likely, if it's just a bunch of statistically likely predictions, what about creativity? With that question in mind, take those next 2 and answer them and think about it. And in this case, what I'm suggesting is that we make 5 Google Docs, 1 for each group, and they write notes in those. I might have set them up in advance with all the questions so they just have spaces to fill in their answers or their thoughts. And then after they've all done this sort of separate group activity, we come back together and to discuss what we've all learned in our different areas so that everyone benefits from that knowledge. And yeah, so that's an example of how a conversation could go. The other part to remember is this can be a topic that some people find very difficult or sensitive for a multitude of different reasons. And so it's really just important to stay transparent, to share to admit that you don't know everything, to hope that across the board you are looking to support each other through perhaps using things like micro affirmations. So to promote the idea of different viewpoints. It's not about one viewpoint being better than another. It's about listening to all the different viewpoints and realizing that we're all in different spaces with something that's new and emerging. And so trying to find ways of doing that within the conversation or to encourage it. And so you might suggest that, like, okay, whenever you are bringing up a new point, be sure to acknowledge the other points that came before in some way. Say, yeah, that's a really interesting way of looking at it when I look at it. Things like that. Using I statements can be another way to do this, right? To say, this isn't how everybody feels, but how I feel. And that can help with that as well. And hoping that students will treat you with that same respect and that you welcome that and that you invite them in to treat you with the similar respect of, like, yes, I understand that's how you feel, but I feel this way, and that's okay. We can all be at a different point and have a different position. This is a slide that just talks about some different techniques you can use. Another idea that I want to highlight on this list is the idea of a parking lot. So that's where you would have a space where you could, if ideas come up during this conversation that don't have anything to do with what's being talked about right now, but they are interesting questions, having a place where students can write those down that you will revisit, or a place where you go, oh, that's really interesting, let me put it in our parking lot for later, can help to put that conversation to the side while you have the one at hand. Again, this is what happens a lot in every conversation I've had about Gen AI, is that we end up going, oh yeah, and another thing, and then we're off in a completely different direction. So I think in this particular case, this is a really good idea to have a space to note those so they don't get lost. And then you can review them later and decide if another discussion is a good idea, or if it's just a matter of sharing that list with the class so they can continue looking into it on their own, or to consider those things in other ways. The other thing I suggest, again, I mentioned this in my example, is the collaborative note taking. And the bonus with that I'll mention again is later on is the fact that when you have a collaborative note taking process and you've developed a document or two, or three or four, those can become resources for a primary resources for another assessment, right? So this could be a very low stakes activity. Maybe you give 1 or 2 points for participating, but the content that you're creating can be used in the assignments later, and that's another incentive for being a part of it. And it's also another way of mitigating AI use, because now you're creating something that is specific to your class that needs to be incorporated into the final assignment. So now that we've kind of talked about the discussion piece, and I know I didn't actually discuss with you, this is the one time I wasn't very meta, but I will be a bit more in this second piece. So part of a discussion could also include some exploration, and this is the idea that as the person at the front of the classroom, or maybe you could have students take turns doing this, that you can demonstrate how these tools actually work as part of the conversation. I have a few reasons why I like this idea a lot. Part of it is around the idea that there's some different frameworks out there about what digital AI literacy means, whether it's literacy or fluency, or what word would be appropriate to use is even in question. But one that I really appreciate is the simplicity of the digital promise model, which is now a global organization. The one who I think originally developed this was an American nonprofit, which I don't know if they're getting any funding anymore. You know how things are. But in any case, the framework's really simple, and I think it is really helpful to think about this. And it's often the case when you're learning something new or trying to understand something new that using it might be helpful. So the idea here is that using the tool, evaluating how that use went, and understanding how it works is all sort of an iterative process, and you build fluency in this tool, you build an understanding of it by using it. Now that said, a lot of people feel uncomfortable using the tool. And so the benefits of doing it as a demo means that, first of all, you're creating a space for a shared experience. So you're all seeing at the same time the same results of the same prompts. So you can have some amount of a conversation around what you're all seeing together. It offers a way of putting the focus on the reflection piece. So like looking at what you generate and what does that mean, rather than getting caught up in playing with the tool. It can demonstrate your own openness to just trying things out, your willingness to experiment and get some feedback. And so you could be putting in prompts and they may go, oh, what would be a better prompt? Why don't you try putting this in? And being open to that might be part of what the demo is. And allowing students to participate in the learning even if they don't want to use the tool. So even if they're concerned about overuse of these tools because of, I don't know, environmental costs, or they are concerned about how these have been trained on copyrighted materials and they don't want to be a part of that. Whatever their concern is around these tools, this gives them a way of seeing what it does without having to actually use it themselves. So it makes sure that everyone has a baseline knowledge, even if they are avoiding or have concerns about the technology. And speaking of those concerns, by demonstrating in the experimentation phase, you're using it less. I personally feel really awkward going to a class of 100 students now and thinking, let's all generate an image individually in the classroom, and then like you'll have to refine it, so you'll probably have to generate 3 more images. Now I've gotten over 300 images generated in 5 minutes, and I can only imagine how much energy that is, right? Especially if last I heard it was about the same as charging my phone for fully to generate one image 300 times over. Then I start feeling concerned about how much I'm putting, how much energy I'm using just to prove a point, right? So if I can demonstrate it in the classroom first, then that's reducing my energy usage of the tool. So this 6-step reflection was put together by my colleague Jason Matthew, who has joined the call. Hello, Jason. And it's just a way of maybe guiding the reflection when you actually use a tool in class. But it can also be used by students in their own reflection process, and can be used as a way to, you could provide these questions as a way of doing reflection after a project that included GenAI as well. So it can be used in different ways. But I'm going to now go ahead and do a live demo. Okay, so please feel free to either talk in the chat or unmute if you'd like to ask me to try something different. I'm actually going to ask if anyone would be willing to tell me that one of the classes you teach, how many students are in it, and the subject. And then I'm going to see what we can do here. So I'm going to see if we can actually have it come up with a plan for how to have a discussion in your class. So would anybody be willing to type into the chat or just unmute and say a class subject that you have and how many students are in the class? If nobody answers, then I'll just do my class. So sometimes it's as simple as, not as simple, but it's as simple as taking on a persona of someone that might be going to a chatbot instead of coming to an expert, and that expert, it'd be someone within your own discipline, right? So I'm gonna play with this idea and turn it around a little bit just to show another example. But maybe it would be like, I am going to be a financial advisor, and so in the classroom that I'm teaching financial advising in, I will ask questions that are often asked of a financial advisor in the Gemini and see what responses I get back and how students analyze or think about what they're seeing in the responses, right? So that could be one way of doing it, right? In this case, because we're in a workshop about discussions with students, I could say, provide me with a discussion plan for a social work class with 40 students. I want to talk about the impact of GenAI on our discipline. And see what it says, right? So it might be helpful, it might not be. I didn't tell it how many students yet. It already suggested a think, pair, share, which is not surprising. It's sort of what I go to as well. And it's just asking them to generally talk about how could it help, how could it not help. I'm like, I want us all to talk together and co-create knowledge. Change this plan. For this approach, there are ask me any questions. You need to do this. Oh, first of all, it tells me it's a great shift because obviously everything I say is brilliant because that's how chatbots work. They assume you are brilliant. That's not annoying at all. Okay, yes, I know. Oh, these are my questions. Do the students already have hands-on experience? Okay. No hands-on experience. 2 physical space. It's a classroom with movable tables. And 3, the output is a shared document. AI social work, everything gets a name too, I've noticed. Any thoughts on what it's coming up with? 5 large sheets of paper around the room. So it's suggesting like a gallery walk, where how does AI remember a conversation decide, rather than how does a social worker remember a client? If a machine learns from the internet, what does it learn about our clients? Which sort of gets to your bias question. So what I see is it might come up with a framework, but it would need a lot of work. And then the next question I'd ask is whether this was worth my time to do it this way, or whether it would have been just as fruitful for me to sit down and think it through and maybe do some research and do this myself. Is this really the tool I want to use to do this kind of work, right? And then again, like part of the reason we're doing this series is to encourage people to talk to folks in their own department about having us come in to have that conversation. Because I think what we're kind of talking about too is that we need to have these conversations with our students, because rather than just not talking about it, they need to know that we're a good resource to come to, right? They need to know that we're going to be in this with them. And we're not a good resource to come to because we're expert tech folk who have helped to design these. We're experts to come to because we understand that these tools exist. We've had enough experience with them to understand the basics of what they might be able to do. And we're here to help weigh and balance and think through whether you want to use it or not, and how that might play out in your career. We want to talk about it too. Like, we're in the room, we want to talk about it too, and we have concerns too. You have concerns, we have concerns. We're not against each other in this. We want to talk about it. And so, yeah, I think one of the approaches that we've been looking at is like having conversations with faculty about how they want to approach this with students, because every person in that faculty has their own perspective as well. So how can it be that we can have these conversations? Me personally, I think we all have to be human beings in that room. I mean, we all have to say, like, listen, I'm not representing my whole faculty or department, but, I'm thinking about this, and not prescribing things. So anyway, hope that's helpful too. Jennifer or Maria, do you have anything else to add to that conversation, or my colleagues, Jason and David? No, all good, Maria? Okay, good. Well, it's helpful though, I think, to hear like how these conversations come about. And even if you're not necessarily directly participating in that conversation, hearing the conversation as just think about yourself as being like the students in this little mini room. Hearing other people have that conversation is even beneficial, right? To know that those concerns are out there. So hopefully that is helpful just to see as a demo. And to see how, it can go so easily in different directions, and how do you pull it back to the conversation at hand is really tricky. And it's something that we're all working and grappling with. So some resources and next steps to take through, and depending on how much we want to keep chatting, we'll probably end a little early today. But just so you know, I started collecting some resource options early on in the ChatGPT explosion. My first reaction was to start collecting all the resources we were throwing at each other into a document so that we could share it more broadly across campus. And so one of the first documents we had that we were sharing was that document of all these resources. The truth is that not only is it impossible to keep up with, it's just going to become completely unwieldy to share every single resource that's out there and to make sure it's vetted and great. It's not a horrible list. It's still, I think, a great list of things, but in order to actually capture what would be helpful for you, I think it does take doing a little bit of research on your own to see to find other things. There's so much out there now, and so many people are approaching it in different ways. But some of the main resources that you'll want to know about is the guides here. Under TMU guides and resources are all things that are great to share with students. So this is not a list of things for you. These are a list of things you can share with students. And some of that overlaps. For example, the GenAI literacy guide that our team created was a guide that was meant for both you and your students to be able to share and use together. And some of these, like the Gemini Help Center, if you need help, you can get help there as well. But these are all things that are open to students. I also shared a couple of external guides. These are just examples of things that are out there that have been shared by others on our team that might be useful, or at least give you some idea of some of the things that are available. And my favorite box is the blue box, which is the thought-provoking multimedia box. And some things that I've been listening to or have experienced in the past. The one at the bottom, Necessary Tomorrows from Al Jazeera, is a really interesting one. It's a podcast series of I think 4 to 6 episodes where they actually take a future view of things, where they actually look at it's almost like these little essays looking at the world as if it were the future and what things have become. And it's really interesting because it takes a very social justice lens and looks through these at like what could be the implications of this new technology. And it's a couple years old already, but I think it stands up. The other two are highlighting some of the great thinkers in this space that are not your basic tech folks from Silicon Valley talking about implications and thinking about this. One is a PhD candidate from Harvard, I believe, at the top, and then Dr. Tinit Jibru is, I think I'm saying her name's wrong actually, Gabru, is an expert who used to work at Google and is brilliant and talks a lot about the hype and what's going on in terms of what's going on with the hype around GenAI. And then, of course, I've got some examples of discipline-specific resources just to show that they're out there, and you might want to look into those. Yes, I'm just going to agree with Abdul too. That's my biggest concern right now is whose hands this technology's in and what certain governments think about it. And I don't know. I have a lot of questions. There's a lot of things that aren't clear, and that makes me nervous. I like transparency. And I would teach journalism, so that shouldn't be a surprise. I don't love the idea of my students using tools that aren't transparent or aren't transparent enough, and then putting it into their work that is supposed to be demonstrating transparency, right? Anyway, see, I'm going to be derailed multiple times. But the thing I have at the bottom there is the idea of speaking to your subject librarian, and they might have some really good ideas about how to find some interesting things. And also, even looking at the list above that has multimedia, there might be some discipline-specific multimedia things you could share with students. Sometimes it's great to share a podcast with students because it's something they can listen to wherever. So it's another way of getting them to listen to something before they come to class, for example, or to do further thinking about it that they could use then to maybe be integrated in some way into some sort of assessment. My final informational slide here is about taking next steps. And what you can do from here. So if you've had a conversation with students, you can do things like provide a chat. Like I have a few options there that are listed, including Google Forms. These are a bit more one-way options or one-on-one options, but it's kind of nice sometimes to have a chat space, a Google chat space, where you can just share things you're finding or interesting stuff. We have one of those amongst a lot of our colleagues, where we'll come across things and just every 2, 3, 4 days, once a week, there'll be something pops up and goes, hey, I just saw this. Isn't this interesting? And if you have time and bandwidth to look at it, there's something interesting to check out. And so you're building your knowledge together by providing a space where you can share things. There can be peer feedback sessions on work that ends up integrating GenAI. So another way to have discussion could be between peer-to-peer. And again, like I mentioned before, using those discussions as a primary source for other types of assessments, I think is really powerful, and has been something that I've been recommending in a lot of consults. Adding a reflection component to assessment. So after you've had this conversation, or you've had multiple conversations, you will have sort of modeled how to reflect on the use of GenAI. You could offer an opportunity to reflect on how it was used in coursework as well. So that's another form of discussion in a sense. And of course, student surveys, postmortems, or periodically checking in with students to see how they're feeling about these things, if the conversation helped, if they have lingering questions, and that sort of thing. So with that, if anyone has any more questions, you can write them in the chat, or we can keep talking for a little bit. Maybe we'll wrap up at 1:45, since that's when Abdul needs to go anyway, unless we want to keep talking. I want to draw your attention to the fact that we do have other workshops. So there is a recording of GenAI and written assignments available. And as David has just shared the link, please click the link that David had just shared. And it's a really quick survey to just let us know that you attended and what you thought of the workshop. And we collect those for all our workshops, and it helps us with our reporting at the end of the year. And also, Again, to reiterate that one of the reasons for us having these sessions is to encourage folks to think about whether or not a session for your unit or department would make sense to help you navigate this as colleagues. And so feel free to write to askhelt@torontomu.ca after you've talked to folks if they're interested in that, or if you'd like to learn more about that. Or if you just want to speak to someone one-on-one, you can also write to askhelt@torontomu.ca and get in touch with any of us. And yeah, so thank you for joining us.